I'm Johnny. You're watching A View to a Grill, and today it's my brand new Weber Kettle cart built for the 22-inch Weber Kettle. And if you want to see other videos on the barbecue topic, be sure to like and subscribe. First, let's talk about this tabletop. This is made out of plywood. Under no circumstances can you leave it out here. If you leave this out here, it will delaminate. I'll store it in the garage when not in use and take it out of the garage when in use. I needed a flat tabletop in order to use my dolly, which gets you shots like this. If I were going to store it outside, I would use wood like this Ipe for instance. But I needed a smooth top, so I used plywood. Let's get started. What I like to do first is put down a sheet of styrofoam. Now what this allows me to do is set the whole sheet of plywood on it and use it as a base so that when I cut through it, I don't have to have it up on a table, the end of it hanging off of a table. Everything stays nice and level right on the floor. What I'm doing here is measuring the end on both sides at 48 inches. We'll use a framing square to mark a straight line. I'll put down the track for my circular saw. Now this is supposed to ensure that I get a straight cut, but when I pulled the trigger, the track jumped on me and I didn't notice. It's okay, we can fix it. So if you notice right here, I'm a little bit off the mark, but I'll show you how to fix that later. Now at this point, you're going to want to go over to French River Springs. Find how to laminate 3 sheets of plywood into one. Follow those instructions to show you how to do it. Now of course you're only going to do 2 unless you choose to do 3, but he'll show you all the details that you need to go through to laminate multiple sheets of plywood together. Please remember, if you're going to make this table for yourself, use a material that is meant to be outside. Plywood will delaminate the very first time it gets rained on. This is my tool vest. It's put out by the Atlas company, and it has a lot of pockets, a lot of magnets, a little flashlight thing on the shoulder. It's awesome. Now I want the final cooking grate to be at about 36 inches. So if I take the side paneling, add it to the height of the casters, add that to the thickness of the tabletop, and then add in the height of the clips that I'm going to use, I'm going to end up at about 36 inches at the final cooking grate, give or take. So what we want to do is start off by squaring one end of your paneling on all the boards. Once one end is square, we'll just measure over 30 inches and then mark it off. I'll go ahead and set up a stop block to cut at 30 inches just so that all of our paneling is exactly the same length. Now if it ends up being 30 inches and an 1/8 or 30 inches and a 1/16 or 29 and 7/8 or whatever, it's fine, because as long as they're all the exact same length, you're going to be able to square up everything. Now on the front side, I've chosen to make this 5 boards wide, and on the sides I've chosen to make this 4 boards wide, in addition with a 1x2 to cap off the ends of the side. Now what I like to do, just for future use and ease of telling me what kind of work I've done, I like to mark off the end of the boards that I did not square off, just so that gives me a visual of anything I still need to do with that particular piece of lumber. Now I like to clean up the cuts just so that I can get a better fit from the lumber, because those little splinters do cause gaps when you want everything to fit tightly together. Now we're going to lay out the deck to the bottom of the Weber Kettle cart. Now since the front is going to be 5 1x6s wide, then I'm going to make the deck 5 1x6s wide. Now you notice that I have a little bit of overhang by the leg without a wheel. on that one board that's going perpendicular to the others. That is because I am going to try to produce a floating effect for the Weber kettle. So we just lay them out, mark how deep we want the box to be. We'll set up a stop block for these as well, just so that the lengths will all be exactly the same. It's so important to have the lengths exactly the same when you're trying to get all of this squared up as best you can from stock lumber. Once we have all our cuts, we're going to lay out the deck on the floor, scribe the length that our sides need to be, go over to the miter saw, set up a stop block so that the sides will be exactly the same length, and make our cuts. Now remember, I've squared off one end to all the lumber, even the 2x4s. Now the two sides that I put down that are going inside the 2x4s are 20 inches. So how I came to that is that I know the depth of the bottom shelf or decking of the Weber kettle cart is 23 inches. So all I did was subtract the width of two 2x4s, which gives me 20 inches, and went over, set up the stop blocks for that, and made my cuts. We'll get everything set up. Now that I know that everything fits together well, we'll go ahead and pre-drill some holes so that we can get all of this put together. Here's a little trick that I use to get a twist out of a 2x4. Now remember, you're using stock lumber, so it's not going to be perfect. All I do is clamp one end, apply some pressure, get the twist out, and then screw in the screw, and there you go. Twist is now gone. Now we're just going to get the deck together using clamps to hold everything in place. I'll make all my marks. And I'll be sure to use a shorter deck screw so that I don't run in to the screws that I've previously screwed on. Now here you'll notice that this board also has a small twist in it. So we'll go ahead and fix that. I'll just back the screws out, use some clamps to close that gap, and screw it back in. Now in this case, I didn't get the twist completely out. When you're using stock lumber right off the shelf, just do the best you can with it. So let's talk a little bit about this build. The purpose of this build is to show you how my process is whenever I come up with a new design for a Weber kettle cart. It also I want to stress, it uses lumber straight off the shelf of Home Depot. So when you buy lumber straight off the shelf, it is not going to be perfectly square. That lumber has been sitting there for some time. It's been handled. It's going to have cups, twists, curves, or whatever. What you want to do is pick out the straightest lumber possible. Get that home and work with it. Now there are videos out there from woodworkers that show you how to make your lumber perfectly square when you use it. But most people don't have table saws, joiners, and planers to do that with. So just remember that as you're watching this video and you see some things that may not be perfect, it's because I'm using imperfect lumber. But the final result is going to be nice, and it will be something you'll be proud of to have on your deck. Now we're going to put the top of the kettle cabinet together. Now this is where the table is actually going to sit. So that's only going to have 3 sides. Now remember, we already cut the front when we cut the front and the back earlier. So that piece is already there. And then the 2 sides is just going to be 23 inches minus the width of one 2x4, which is 1.5 inches. So we're going to make the 2 top sides 21.5 inches. We'll get those squared up and put together. Here I'm just doing a quick dry fit to see how everything fits together. And then that's when I notice I cut the sides just a little bit too long. But this is a prototype, so the whole purpose of this build is for me to learn from my mistakes. And as you watch the video, you're also going to learn from my mistakes. So now we're going to put the cabinet together. Here I'm using my workbench, and I know my workbench is perfectly flat. I also have my workbench leveled on the floor. So as long as I know I'm working with a perfectly flat, level surface, then I know, or at least I have confidence, that my final product will be square. Because we've cut everything the same length, we're working on a table that's flat and square, or flat and level. So, you know, maybe that's maybe that's not how it's supposed to be done, but that's what I do. We'll get all of our screw holes marked, pre-drill, and put it together. Now the reason why I pre-drill everything is because I'm working so close to the edge of the wood that if you don't, you're going to end up splitting all of your lumber. And that just means you need to go back to the store and buy some more. So go ahead and take the time to pre-drill and sink and countersink your holes so that you won't split the lumber. Now I have everything clamped together, and I've pre-drilled the holes to the top of the cabinet, and we're going to get that screwed together. Also, if you don't have a lot of clamps, I mean, you could do it without clamps, but you're not going to have a, well, if I did it without clamps, it wouldn't come out right, you know. I have to have clamps. So if you don't have a lot of clamps, I'd recommend you go buy some inexpensive lamps from Harbor Freight, or the little multi-package clamps from Home Depot or Lowe's, and get those. Because if you're going to do stuff like this, have little projects, you're going to want a lot of extra hands, and clamps are extra hands. We'll go ahead and finish up the paneling, and here is the final product. So on the bottom shelf of the cabinet, I know that I'm going to have to put in some casters. So I don't want to screw anything in to where it would impede me when I'm putting the casters on. What I want you to get out of this mostly is the design and the shape of the table, because you can replace this tabletop with any material you want that would better withstand the weather. Now at this point, it's just easier to do a quick sanding. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to do a quick sanding, and I'm also going to spray in some water sealant. In this case, I have some leftover Thompson's water seal, so that's what I'm going to use. I'll just wipe everything clean, grab my spray bottle, and spray in the water Thompson seal. And just so that it has an even coat, I'll wipe it down and let it dry. Now, since it's already on the top of my table and it's easier to sand here, I'm going to give everything light sanding with some 120 sandpaper. Okay, let's go ahead, turn it over on the floor, mark out where we want our casters to be. We're going to also pre-drill these holes and then get them screwed in. I'm using 1.5 inch caster bolts. Now you may feel like you need a little bit longer of a bolt, but I'm thinking these work out just fine. You'll also notice here that I have put some wood putty in all of my screw holes. That's just so when I paint it, we won't see the little dips of the screw holes. Everything will be nice and flush, and you'll never know that I even had screws in there. I'll go ahead and sand all those screw holes down with the putty to get them flush. just because it's easier to do it now without the tabletop being on it. I'll go ahead and get all the screws out of the plywood because I'm about to paint it, and I wanted something to put the tabletop on because I didn't want to put it back on wet paint. So we'll go ahead and do it now and get it all painted up. Here I was going to use a roll-on brush, but I didn't like the texture. So I decided to go ahead and use a paintbrush to get all this in. Now this paint, it's actually decking paint from Home Depot. It's Padre Brown and it's really thick so that if you have any imperfections in your wood, this will cover and fill them up. As you're painting, you don't want your brush strokes to be going in random directions. So be sure while it's still wet to go ahead and apply long, straight brush strokes in the direction of your wood grain just to give it the best look. Earlier in the video, you recall that my saw jumped on me when I was making the cut. So now we have to fix that. And we're going to use our framing square and that track again to get 3 sides square. Remember, we don't need the 4th side square because I'm going to draw an arc in that side later, so we don't need to cut that part. We'll get everything marked up, straight line, set up our track, and make our cut. Now it just so happens that the Weber Kettle lid is the perfect template for drawing your kettle hole. I'll make sure it's all centered, mark my line, and then in this video I'm going to show you how to do it free-handed with a jigsaw. In my previous video you saw where I set up a jig using my router. In this video I just wanted to show that there's more ways to do this than just one. So we're using a jigsaw without a jig just so you can see what the potential results can be. There's my cut and it actually looks pretty good. There are some waves in it, but you wouldn't be able to pick them up with the eye, and once we sand it down they're going to be even less noticeable. Now you see here where at the end it broke off, but that's not even an issue. We're just going to round that off anyway with the sander. We'll get everything sanded down, work on those corners a little bit, and call that done. Now we'll go ahead and square up the other 2 ends. Once that's completed, I'll set up for drawing the arc. Here I'm going to use one of the clips that's going to hold up the Weber Kettle as my point of reference. I'll just find the center of the table, mark a line, screw in the clip, I'll grab a piece of wire and draw the arc. Now I want to be sure to stress that you use wire and not string. String has the tendency to stretch, so your arc won't be as good as it can be. Use wire, make sure it's already stretched out just so that you'll have a nice, pretty, even line all the way across. And there's our arc. We're going to use the jigsaw again and we're going to do it freehand again to make this cut. Now if I make this table again, I probably will build a jig to do these cuts. They just turn out smoother and nicer. That's our cut. Looks pretty good. We're going to go ahead and put the brackets in. I'm using 2.5 inch brackets, L brackets, marking and pre-drilling the holes where they need to be. Now remember, I used the lid as a template. Through experience, I know that my finger is about 1/2 inch wide. So I'm going to use my finger as a guide to get these clips 1/2 inch away from the side. Now, just because I've built these before, I know that's the perfect length so that when I set the Weber Kettle bowl in, it's going to fit just like it should fit. I'm sure there are more scientific ways to figure that out, but through trial and error, that's how I figured it out. Hopefully your finger is that wide. Let's get all these marked and screwed in. I'll place 2 in each corner and 2 on the other end where the Weber Kettle is going to be. And that's what they look like once they're all installed. We'll get the tabletop a final sanding Here I'm using 120 grit sandpaper, and I'm also thinking it's looking pretty cool right now. For the tabletop, I'm using a combination Olympia wood stain / water sealer. Now this is the first time I've used this product, so I'm not exactly sure at this point how it's going to come out. Now I do like the way it looks. This is the transparent version. Now there's a clear version that you cannot see, but I thought the transparent version, in my case, it'll make it look a little bit better because it'll bring out the darker wood grain in the wood. Now I have an idea that this will work out for me because this plywood on my workbench has been in my garage for 5 or 6 years now, and it's not delaminating. It's still in good shape. And this table is right next to my garage door, so it has the opportunity to get wet on occasion, but like I said, it's lasting a while. That's why I'm not afraid to do this tabletop in plywood. I ended up putting 2 coats on, and now let's get this table together. So here is where my measurements were just slightly off. I could put some trim there, but to be honest with you, it really just doesn't bother me that much to correct that. The laminate in the plywood does have some imperfections, and that is where one of the screws, whenever I put these 2 pieces of plywood together, that is the cross section of one of the screws. I could fix that just by putting a little bit of putty in it and calling it a day, but in the end I'll call it a conversation piece. Now I will never leave this table out in the weather. This is going to be a garage table or a patio table, so it's going to have some protection, but it's not going to be outside. It'll be outside when I'm cooking. So that's my Weber Kettle table build. If you like it, I hope you try building it yourself. Be sure to like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.